One, the singular racists who are in civil society, and they've been there from the 50s. They've been driving this whole ethno-religious majoritarianism. That's one group. They are in civil society. They're not outside civil society. Two, Tamil civil society, which went along with and still goes along with everything that the LTT did and Prabhakaran, and make excuses. They have not internalized, not even the ones in the West, have internalized liberal democratic values to the extent that they are critical openly of the fascism of the Tigers. That's Tamil civil society. And the third, that element, cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic element, which went along with the CFA and everything that appeased the Tigers, and they never stood up for territorial unity. A civil society in the rest of the world, if you take Europe, the biggest claim of post-war civil society after World War II was that it stood up against fascism, against the Nazis. The best philosophers, the best writers, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, the test was, where were you when the Nazis were around? Were you part of the resistance? But in Sri Lanka, Colombo civil society was not part of the resistance against the Tigers, it was part of the appeasement of the Tigers. So also Tamil civil society. And the other lot, the ones I talked about earlier, remain.
Don't you think that this contributes to the rise of the chauvinists?
Oh, absolutely, because when the Western educated no longer stand for a liberal patriotism, then it opens the door to an illiberal patriotism. And that's what has happened, and that's what continues to happen. And that is, in fact, part of the crisis of the democratic opposition, which will probably manifest itself in the election results of the other two councils. We've been talking about the North-South axis, but there's also a South-South dynamic, the Northwestern province and the Central province. The failure of liberal democracy in Sri Lanka to throw up what I call a smart patriotism leaves it open to the Neanderthal nationalists. And this is our most profound crisis today.
Dr. Jayatilleka, we were talking about the other two provincial councils as well now, the Northwest and the Central Provincial Council, where the opposition has claimed that it will win and then call for a general election as well and hope to win that as well. How do you see the opposition faring in the Northwestern and Central Provincial Council elections?
Well, yes, I am familiar with this, because I think the leader of the opposition has said that the elections for the two councils should be used as a kind of a pressure point on the government to force the government into holding a parliamentary election next year in 2014 and winning it, the opposition winning it. Now, I was puzzled, I must confess, because I didn't think that the opposition was in the kind of shape that it would want to say, bring it on, 2014. I thought it would want more time for the economic crisis to mature, but no, it's kind of gung-ho. So if that claim is to be tested, we would have to set a benchmark, a low benchmark, of at least 40% in terms of the opposition's performance. Why do I say 40%? I don't want to be unfair. I say 40% because when the UNP left office after 17 turbulent years, not all of which were bad, but 17 turbulent years, and when its candidate at that election which it lost, the presidential election, was assassinated and was succeeded by his widow, Srimati Sanayaka, who was at that point not a UNP member, she was the politician. The UNP succeeded on its way out in getting 43%. That was in 1994. Now we are in the 19th year of the UPFA government, which has seen two presidents, Chandrika Banaranaike Kumaratunga and Mahinda Rajapaksa, but only one leader of the opposition, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. So I would assume that at its lowest, the opposition should be able to get at least something like it achieved on its way out in 1994, which is 43%. Let's make it 40. Now, if it can't do that, and if we are really talking about the 30% range, we're still even the lower 30%, 30 plus, just not plus plus, but 30 plus, then the opposition is in serious struggle. So also is democratic politics in Sri Lanka, because it would show complete lopsidedness.
Complete imbalance. Well,
absolutely.
We'll get back to that topic in a little while. We're going in for a short commercial break. Welcome back to the program. Dr. Jayatilleka, now, when we left off, we were talking about the opposition's, what a failure for the opposition in this election, not a loss, but a failure in terms of the number of votes it gets would mean for democracy in the country. There would be a serious imbalance. Now, there's also now an emerging force within the opposition in terms of, well, he emerged and now he's on the sidelines again, trying to get back in. We're talking former Army commander and leader of the Democratic Party, Sarath Fonseca. Do you see, if the main opposition fails at these provincial council elections, do you see a force rising through the third force, if you will, to correct the imbalance?
Well, let's watch that. That's one of the most fascinating things about this election. Which is the third force? Is it going to be General Fonseca's Democratic Party, or would it remain the JBP? And would either of these aspirants to the status of third force do well? I mean, by well, I mean, can either of them get over the 10% mark? That would be the cutoff for an impressive third force. I don't have any speculation on that. I really don't know enough. I've heard things, but I wouldn't want to speculate. But I'd be watching General Fonseca, because it is interesting to see whether there has been a shift of UNP voters, whether the UNP voters are going to stay at home, or whether they are going to shift to either General Fonseca or the JVP. These are possibilities. There was a very interesting UN Sustainable Development report which said that Sri Lanka is one of the unhappiest countries in the world. Of 156, I think we're 137 or something. I mean, Pakistan is a lot happier than we are. India is a lot happier. And we are just talking about the third world. Let's not talk about Switzerland or whatever. Now, I think there's a lot to be unhappy about. Now, this unhappiness should, theoretically, translate itself into a strong protest vote against the government and in favor of the UNP.
But do you think that this unhappiness may be on a... I'm sure there's lots of causes to be unhappy. Political is just one factor. But do you think political unhappiness stems from there being a lack of choice in terms of representation?
Well, I think the election will show whether the unhappiness that exists, obviously, about the status quo in general, the way things are, whether there's a greater degree of unhappiness about the UNP and its leadership. I mean, people may be unhappier about the UNP than they are about Mahinda Rajapaksa, because the campaign is being carried by President Rajapaksa. So this is, in a way...
You think the President has been making... he's also now on the campaign trail trying to garner support for UPFA candidates, not just in the north, but also in the northwest and in the central provinces. Do you see, now that the President is also on the campaign trail and pushing hard, do you see the opposition being able to combat that in their campaign?
Well, Nadeem, I would draw a sharp distinction between the northern provincial election process and the NWP and the central province. I've watched television footage. President Rajapaksa seems to be back to the old, switched on Mahinda Rajapaksa is obviously relishing the campaign. I mean, he's really animated, and I think he's doing okay. He's doing well. As for the North, that's something else, because what is going to be tested in the North is not just the popularity of the government, but it is the entire model of post-war rule that the government has seen fit to experiment with in the North. It may not be a referendum on what the TNA says in its manifesto, but it's certainly a referendum on the status quo, on the model of rule that has prevailed there. Now, I'm not really convinced that that model of rule is going to get resounding endorsement, to put it mildly, from the people of the North. Now, there was another way of doing this. And that was to have elections in 2009, 2010.
Was it practical though? I mean, so soon after the war to have an election?
Nothing. They had a local government election in August 2009. And Devananda did very well. He started doing badly in 2010. That's when you had a very heavy, top-heavy, singular government sort of ruling family presence in the North.
But couldn't you also claim that it's because between that period, we've had a lot more IDPs being resettled and being able to vote, and thereby we saw a shift in the
Well, the IDPs, when they, before they became IDPs, if you want to put it that way, when they came out of Nandikada, there was that moment where there was a sense of complete failure on the part of the Tigers and some kind of gratitude towards the Sri Lankan army, which had rescued them, a certain paradigm shift. There was a moment. Now, the government of Sri Lanka, and I must say the army commander at that time, General Fonseca, blew it, because that moment was not captured. Instead, there was Manik Farm and prolongation in Manik Farm, and the barbed wire, and the armed guards. Now, somewhere along the line, that moment dissipated, and you had a reactivation of the old nationalist resentments.
But don't you think at that time there were, in the case of Manik Farm and Chetikulam and the IDP camps, there were legitimate security concerns to warrant not making use of that moment to have elections?
When you weigh it up, I would think not. I remember the Vietnamese ambassador in Geneva talking to me about this, and he said, look, we had a much bigger problem than you had. We had 1.5 million South Vietnamese military guys who were working with the Americans. But you mustn't have these photographs of old people and children behind barbed wire with armed guards. I mean, you know, it's a no-brainer. He said, our experience was that nobody over 40 or under 14 is a potential terrorist.
Security threat.
Right. So those people should be in something like an open camp. The others under these circumstances. And I remember what he told me was validated by